So again, this afternoon, we're going to take a look at some of the principles that are associated with life. So you've had a chance to read and annotate, so this shouldn't be too foreign for you. We are going to start here with our learning objectives. There are a few learning objectives for chapter 1, which is a view of life. And so our main goal here is to establish sort of this set of criteria for determining whether or not something is living or not, right? So one of the things you should be able to do by the end of this chapter is describe features that distinguishes living things from non-living things. So you should have already sort of identified them. Depending on the textbooks you're using, there are about 7 or 8 properties that we say must be met in order for a organism to be considered a living thing, okay? Each organism must be able to carry out each one of those properties, okay? And then as we're exploring this look at life, we'll look at how life is organized, right? So you know the levels of biological organization. For example, the human, we've got the cells, tissues make organs, and organs function together as an organ system. So we'll take a look at some of the levels of organization from the organism standpoint, okay? But we'll also consider life from an ecological standpoint, okay? So ecological standpoint is basically when we take into account the environment, right? So we're consumers by nature, right? We don't produce our own foods. So we, in that sense, are heavily dependent on our environment, right? For survival, right? We get a lot of the things that we need for sustaining us from our environment, such as the air we breathe, the food that we eat, the water that we drink. And so ecology is another branch of science that is important as we take a look at life. So we'll look at how we can study life from an ecological standpoint. We'll also determine the importance of information transfer within and between systems. And these systems are just talking about living things, like how's the information transfer from one system to another? Well, that just is your DNA, right? We inherit our DNA from our mom and dad, and that essentially becomes a blueprint for how we exist. Okay, so the information that's encoded in our DNA is transferred from mom and dad down to offspring, and it is that information that dictates how we function, right? So all of the information, the genes that we inherit, it encodes the information for protein synthesis and for our bodies to be able to function. And so that information transfers is important. And we'll also take a look at the flow of energy, right? So energy is certainly a requirement for life. So we'll take a look at how we acquire and utilize energy, all right? Through consumption of food, as well as the sunlight as the major source of energy, and how that energy is then transferred throughout ecosystems. And so we'll take a look at that from from producers on to consumers. And then lastly, as we look at life, right, we know that there are millions and millions of different organisms that we continue to discover. And so we'll take a look at this binomial system of nomenclature, which is basically the means for which we name and categorize organisms, right? So the binomial system of nomenclature, as that prefix suggests, is a 2-part naming system. So we assign this sort of first and last name to organisms based on the presence or absence of specific features. All right, so we'll talk about that binomial system of nomenclature a little bit. And then lastly, we'll look at this theory of evolution. So evolution is a very important it's an important topic that can also become a very controversial topic. So we're not going to go into the conversation of whether or not evolution is real or whatever, the origin of life. But from a biological standpoint, we know that evolution happens, and it's a fact of life as it relates to our genetics and our DNA. Right? So this evolution that we experience in the context of life is due to these changes or mutations in our DNA that these mutations or changes are basically providing us with these survival advantages that we need to continue to adapt and survive throughout time. Okay, so the scientific theory of evolution is something that has been proven to be true as it relates to our DNA. Okay, so those are our objectives. By the end of this chapter, these are things that you should be familiar with. Are you all able to see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see the objectives. Now, are the slides advancing right now?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so let's start. We're talking about life. Life. What does it mean to be alive? Somebody tell me, what does it mean to be alive?
I had it.
What does it mean to be alive?
Oh.
What does it mean to be alive? How do you know that you're alive? Because we're breathing. Because you're breathing? Okay. So all living things breathe?
You said what?
So all living things breathe?
No.
Okay. So how else do you know that you're alive?
Able to function.
Because what?
Like we're still functioning. Like
because you're functioning, right? There's movement, right? What else? What are some other properties that you can think of? Somebody else, help us out. How do you know that you're alive? Like, what does it mean to be alive? Okay, so let's take a look at that. And so what we're getting ready to do is take a look at this concept of the principles that are required, right? These properties must all be met in order to be considered a living thing, okay? So these are some characteristics of life. Write these down if you haven't already, all right? These characteristics of life are such that all living things, right? No matter how different they are from one another, right? So if you look at this slide that I have here, we see a variety of organisms. We have rodents, we have plants, mushrooms, fish, okay? So all living things, right? No matter how different from each other that they may be, they all share a common set of characteristics, right? And we're about to jot down these characteristics that must be met by all things that we're going to be considered that we're going to consider a life form, okay? Be it a tree, be it a plant, be it a mouse, all of these characteristics must be met. Before I go on, I want to make sure that we understand what is the scientific term for a living thing? Anything that's considered to be alive, what do we call that? You should have got that in your reading.
Is it an organism or no?
It's an organism. Thank you. So when I use the term organism, I want you to pause and understand that I'm not talking about like something that's just foreign that we, you know, might grow in the lab or whatever. Oftentimes students like, oh, okay. So when I use the term organism, I'm talking about anything that's living, all right? So we've got to go a little step beyond what we're used to thinking about as a life form, right? Trees outside are organisms, right? Plants are organisms, right? So I'll use that term a lot. And before I continue to talk, I want to make sure that we understand the definition of a living thing. We call that an organism, right? So let's look at these basic properties of life. Go ahead and jot these down, right? You should have each of these right now from your annotation guide. All living things share some basic properties. One is that there's some type of cellular organization. What does that mean?
I missed the cellular organization.
What does that mean? That's what is that saying? If I say that all organisms have cellular organization, what is that telling me? So that's just another way of saying that all living things contain cells, right? That's our first point. All living things are made up of what?
Cells.
Cells, right? And so this concept of organization, we'll get to it when we go through our biological organization. It just means that this organism, right, is made up of cells that are organized or arranged in some manner, right? But the cell is the basic unit of life. Okay, that's the first rule for exploring life. All life forms are made up of cells, right? So the next property is reproduction. Okay, what is this property telling us?
That they're still able to reproduce their own kind.
Right, that in order for life to continue to exist, okay, for a given species, there must be reproduction. Okay, now go ahead and understand here that we're not saying that every member of that species has to reproduce, but some members of that given species has to reproduce in order to continue to perpetuate life for that species, right? So reproduction is a requirement for life amongst any species of organisms. Okay, so then I'll ask the question, what would happen if there were no reproduction?
A lot of things wouldn't be here, including us.
Okay, so I'm looking for a word. What will be the scientific result of no reproduction? These species or organisms would what?
Extinct.
They would become extinct. Absolutely. So write that down in your notes and understand, you know, what this topic of reproduction as a requirement for life, what does this mean? It means that some members of this species have to reproduce in order to continue to maintain that species, right? All right. Next property, metabolism. What is metabolism, guys? Somebody else other than Ms. Booth, tell me, what is metabolism? What does that word mean?
It's a chemical process that occur within a living organism in order to maintain life.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well,
so you hit the nail on the head with chemical processes, right? So when you think about metabolism, or even like in your body, metabolism is just a general term that does refer to like all of the chemical reactions that are taking place like in our bodies, right? So digestion, our bodies are constantly undergoing chemical reactions, metabolic activity, breaking down foods and so forth, producing waste, burning energy. We undergo many different types of metabolic activities throughout the day. And so this is a requirement for life, right? Obtaining energy, utilizing energy, these are all forms of metabolism, okay? Where we break down complex molecules in order to release the energy that it contains, or where our bodies synthesize and make molecules in order to facilitate other biological processes, right? So catabolic activities, anabolic activities, these are all types of chemical reactions or metabolic processes that go on in our bodies, all right? So metabolism is a requirement for life. These are chemical reactions that are constantly going on, and it is, in fact, a property of life. Homeostasis, this is another property. What does homeostasis mean? What does this term mean? Anyone? You've seen this word before. All right, so homeostasis refers to our body's attempt to maintain sort of this balanced state, right? This state of equilibrium, right? If something's off, our bodies have mechanisms mechanisms in place to try and restore harmony, get things back to what we would say normal, okay? But we'll make sure that we put an asterisk there as I use that word normal, because normal is a pretty relative term, right? There's no such thing as normal, but we have what we would say a normal range, right? Because your normal and my normal could be a little bit different, right? But that's our normal, right? So homeostasis is a very very important property of life, as all organisms, all living things are constantly working to maintain that balance, okay, that constant internal environment. All right, we don't want things all over the place. We want to keep things in this constant state of equilibrium as it relates to things like temperature and water or osmotic pressure or many of the other factors that can fluctuate within a living thing, right? So homeostasis is there. Mechanisms are in place to try and keep things balanced. Heredity. This is another property of life. What is this? What is heredity? This is another requirement for life. What is heredity?
Heredity is like genes, DNA.
Genes and DNA. Yeah, your heredity by definition is the transfer or passing down of genetic information from one generation to the next. So from parent to offspring. This is by far one of the most important properties of life, right? Because we wouldn't exist were it not for the genetic information that we obtained from mom and dad. Right, we're hybrid organisms. That, what does hybrid mean? When I say we're hybrids, what am I meaning? What's a hybrid?
It's like a mix. So
Yes.
are you talking about hybrids because we get genes from both parents?
Absolutely. So we're hybrid organisms. We obtain genetic information from both mom and dad. 23 chromosomes from mom, 23 chromosomes from dad. That information then determines who we are. That sperm and egg unite, we get this fertilized zygote, and then we have this developmental process that continues and that kind of leads us into our next couple of properties of life, which is growth and development, right? That's a requirement for life. I do want you to appreciate the fact that growth and development will look different depending on the organism, okay? So for humans, growth and development starts at conception. When that sperm and egg unite, we have this zygote formed. The next few or several months, there's going to be some growth and development, and it doesn't even stop at birth. Okay, so we start with this embryo, we get a fetus, and then we have a newborn, and you have your infant, and you have your toddler, and you continue to grow and develop. So we know what growth and development looks like, for humans per se. But if you think beyond the human, there's still going to be growth and development throughout the lifespan of all organisms, okay? Although that process can look differently dependent on the organism. One of the properties that I skipped here was responsiveness, okay? So being able to respond to stimuli is a requirement for life, right? All living things must have the ability to respond to what's going on around them, okay? Be it external stimuli, be it internal stimuli. Like if you do not have the capacity to respond, then you might not be alive, okay? Oftentimes, this responsiveness is in the form of a movement, right? Muscle movement, responding to your eyes blinking, that's an involuntary movement. If you were to put your hand on a hot stove, you're going to move your hand away really quickly, all right? So this ability to respond and be responsiveness is a characteristic of being alive. And then the last one, as I mentioned before, this concept of adaptation and evolution. These are facts of life, right? That we must have the ability to adapt and evolve, right? We're being exposed to many different changes from, one generation to the next. And so we have to have this sort of inherent ability to adapt, right? If we are unable to adapt to what's going on around us, what's going to happen? Anyone? What happens if you fail to adapt and evolve over time? What would happen?
Die.
Yeah, say it again.
You would die.
Yeah, we would eventually perish. Absolutely. All right. So this is a requirement for life. So so I know these things kind of seem like this is a lot, but if you just think about it, it makes sense, right? We know that all living things are made up of cells, right? So there's some type of cellular organization. And we'll be able to contrast that a little bit more in a minute as we look at the difference between like a unicellular organism versus a multicellular organism, right? Unicellular organisms have one cell, while multicellular organisms can have thousands and millions of cells. And again, that cellular organization is going to look different depending on the organism. Reproduction, we now understand that that's obviously a requirement for life across any species, and you've got to keep reproducing to keep that population strong, right? If not, we risk extinction. Metabolism, that's how our bodies get the nutrients and chemicals that it needs, okay? Obtaining what we need, using energy. We require energy to carry out our day-to-day processes. All of the chemical reactions that are going on in our bodies require energy. Everything that we do, us being alive, requires energy. So we're using energy as we exist, okay? Thinking, sleeping, breathing, those all require energy. Homeostasis, so you're alive, so your body, the organism, has to have an ability to maintain this nice and balanced state, right? That's what homeostasis is. That's an attempt at an organism to maintain a constant internal environment, regulating temperature and so forth. Heredity, okay, the passing of information from one generation to the next. All right, we're inheriting our genetic information from our parents. Responsiveness, again, you're responding to things that are going on around you, be it external or internal. You've got to be able to respond. There is some feedback going on. Growth and development, right? If you look at yourself, you weren't always the adult that you are now, okay? You started out as a fertilized egg and you made it out and you continued to develop, right? And so all organisms are going to manifest this concept of growth and development. And then lastly, adaptation through evolution. It's just the fact of life. We inherit these changes. Our DNA continues to change over the years, and these changes are basically providing us with survival advantages, all right, so that we can adapt and survive what's going on around us. All right. What questions do we have about this information? I feel like that was a lot of information. Any questions before I keep going? All right, so this should already be in your notes, but I have a slide here that's basically, I know some of us are visual, I'm visual. I just got done running my mouth for a minute, but I'll give you a moment to just kind of take a look at the slides here. And it's just a reiteration of what I just said for those of us that are visual. And you can update your notes as you need to. And we said that all organisms are made up of cells. We know that that's true. All organisms grow and develop. All organisms regulate their metabolic processes. All organisms respond to stimuli, right? All organisms must maintain homeostasis. All organisms reproduce. And all organisms must evolve and adapt to its environment. Okay, so on our exam, if I asked you some type of open-ended question about how do you define life or distinguish between living and non-living, you should be able to sort of describe this collection of properties, of characteristics that would lend us to know that this is a living thing. Okay. Can I go to the next slide?
1 second, I kind of got cut off. My laptop died.
Okay.
I'm trying to catch up. I'm sorry. It's fine. It's recorded. I can go back, right?
Oh, yes, it is. That is
Okay.
correct. And the next slide is just another redundant slide again for those of us that are visual. I laid out again all of the things that living organisms exhibit: growth and development, energy, metabolism, homeostasis, adaptation, responding to stimuli, organization, and reproduction. Okay. So, any questions about this before we move on to our next learning objective? Great. So, then that's a nice checkpoint question. It'll be there when you start doing your review later. So reproduction, let's take a quick look at the different types of reproduction. So this is a requirement for life. And of course, this doesn't happen the same across all organisms. So there's two major forms of reproduction. Go ahead and write those down. Asexual and sexual reproduction. What's the difference between these two forms of reproduction, if anybody remembers? Anyone? What's the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction? That my picture so eloquently demonstrates. Does anyone remember the difference between these two modes of reproduction? Okay, so in your notes, write down that asexual reproduction only requires one parent, one individual. Okay, asexual reproduction only requires one parent to produce an offspring. So what happens is that single parent, right, that single individual would basically duplicate its genetic material and then sort of break off into two new cells, okay, in the process of budding, or just depending on the organism, binary fission. That's an example of asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction only requires one individual. Now, how does that contrast from sexual reproduction? Looking at your screen. What's the difference? What do you see different in sexual reproduction?
Sexual reproduction requires two parents.
Sexual reproduction requires two individuals. Go ahead and write that down. Okay, you should definitely be able to describe these two modes of reproduction and how they differ. Sexual reproduction is a more complex process. It takes a lot longer. Asexual reproduction is very fast. It's very efficient. It's going to, in an ideal world, it's going to duplicate the genetic material of that one individual accurately without very many errors and produce an offspring that's identical. So it's almost like cloning. But sexual reproduction, it is a complex form of reproduction. It requires two individuals and it can be with problems, right? It doesn't always happen with fidelity, all right? And so there are sort of advantages and disadvantages to each of these methods of reproduction, okay? Which form of reproduction do humans utilize?
Sexual.
Sexual reproduction. Make sure you have that in your notes. Requires two parents. It is a long process. It is not very efficient. The advantage, though, is that it does lead to genetic diversity, right? Due to the different distribution of genes across offsprings, whereas asexual reproduction is basically a form of cloning. And so every offspring is going to be genetically identical, right? But there can be problems with that, because if you have a disease or a syndrome or a situation in that parent individual, genetic, okay, a genetic malfunction or disorder, what's going to happen when that offspring is made if this is a genetic disorder?
It's going to have the same genetic makeup.
It's going to be passed down to offsprings, okay? And so while asexual reproduction is a fast and rapid method of producing more organism, it has its disadvantages in that it can pass on abnormalities to offsprings, and it doesn't allow for genetic diversity, okay? Which is an advantage of sexual reproduction, all right? We talked about cellular organization, right? We know that all living things are made up of cells, right? So every organism can either be categorized as being a unicellular organism or a multi. Are my slides advancing, guys?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sometimes it doesn't in Zoom. Organisms can be categorized as either being unicellular or multicellular, okay? You should be able to distinguish between these two. Unicellular organisms, as that prefix suggests, that prefix uni in biology means what? Or in general, uni means what? One, right? Unicellular organisms contain one cell that performs all of the functions that are essential for life. Okay, so these are often referred to as simple organisms, right? Unicellular organisms include bacteria, yeast, protozoa, right? These are all organisms that, you know, those are microscopic organisms. You can't see them with the naked eye because they just contain one cell, but they can carry out all of the functions that are essential for maintaining life. So metabolism, reproduction, all those things that we just talked about, maintaining homeostasis, this single cell can do that. Okay, so unicellular organisms are often referred to as simple organisms. When we get to our unit on cells, we will kind of compare and contrast from a physical standpoint, and you can see structurally how they differ in complexity. Excuse me. Multicellular organisms, in contrast, contain billions and millions of cells that all have specialized jobs to do, right? So multicellular organisms are going to be humans, right? Dogs, cats, plants, trees. Those are all multicellular organisms, right? And so you should be able to easily distinguish between the two types of organisms and, you know, identify them and describe properties, right? Multicellular organisms are going to be more complex. They're going to be eukaryotic organisms that contain, you know, those internal organelles that we don't find in simple like prokaryotic organisms. You're not going to find the nucleus and the mitochondria and all of those in our prokaryotic unicellular organisms, right? So multicellular organisms are all going to be eukaryotes, and they're all going to have this complex arrangement of membrane-bound organelles and other structures present that aren't there in unicellular organisms. All right, so I'd like you to be able to identify examples of organisms that fall under either unicellular organisms or multicellular organisms. I think I mentioned it a little bit before. Okay. I mentioned it before that unicellular organisms are those that are composed of only one cell. So examples include bacteria, yeast, and protozoa. Write that down. I'd like you to be able to identify examples of a unicellular organism. Okay, you're probably most familiar with bacteria, right? Bacteria are all around us. They cause a lot of problems in our lives. You probably had food poisoning before and things like that. Those are caused by bacteria. All right, then there are yeast. Yeast are a type of fungi, right? They're unicellular, but they're not prokaryotic, all right? Oftentimes students mix up and think that all unicellular organisms are prokaryotic. That's not true, all right? So yeast are a type of fungi. And then we have protozoa, all right? These are the unicellular eukaryotes, all right? They cause a lot of problems when you think about diseases in less developed countries, things like malaria. This plasmodium species right here causes malaria, but there are many other protozoa organisms that we deal with in terms of parasites and transmitting diseases in underdeveloped countries where there's like poor sanitation and poor hygiene and so forth, all right? So unicellular organisms. Now, multicellular organisms. These organisms consist of many cells, and they're always going to be eukaryotes. And so that's going to include plants, animals, and some fungi. All right. Now, let's make sure we're clear as we identify, you know, organisms here. We have plants, animals, and fungi. Where are humans in this lineup?
Probably animals.
Animals, right? So are humans unicellular or multicellular?
Multi.
What'd you say?
Multi.
Multicellular. All right, that's a trick question, guys. You should definitely be able to answer that quickly for me. Humans are multicellular organisms, and in science, when we say animals, humans, we're included in that. Okay, when we start going through classification and all of that, and we do our, you know, domains and kingdoms and, you know, plants, animals, fungi, Monera, Protista, humans fall under animals. All right, make a note of that if you didn't already know that. All right, so that's we just went through a lot of information. So we're distinguishing between that cellular organization. We talked about some forms of reproduction. Now let's look at cellular organization a little bit more and look at some levels of biological organization, right? I talked about exploring life or studying life from the organism standpoint and from an ecological standpoint. Let's look at organization from the human, right? This biological organization goes like this. We'll start at the cellular level, right? We know that we're made up of cells. Cells interact together to form what? Huh?
I feel like I know that.
Cells interact together to form what?
Tissue.
It's right here in front of you, tissue, right? And then tissues interact together in a specialized way to form what?
Organs.
Organs. We have our organs acting in concert, forming an organ system or a body system, right? And then that body system leads to being an entire organism, right? And so these are levels of biological organization, right? But if we continue to extend this arrow, we now move from the individual, right, or the organism. Like if you look at some schematics from an ecological standpoint, it's going to start with, it might use the term individual instead of organism. Okay, so ecologists are those scientists that are interested in life as it relates to the environment. Okay, so we study individuals. Okay, we can study life in an individual basis. We can study life from a population standpoint. We study various populations and their interactions. We can study life from the community standpoint, where we have various populations of individuals or species living together in community. And then we can study life from the ecosystem, okay? Put a big asterisk by this ecosystem, okay? When we're talking about exploring life and distinguishing between living and non-living, the ecosystem is the level of organization where we now take into account non-living factors, okay? Abiotic, okay? So you may have seen the term biotic and abiotic as you were reading. The ecosystem is the level of organization where we study both the living factors, so the life forms, as well as the non-living factors, okay, those abiotic factors. So what are some examples of abiotic factors in an ecosystem? Anyone? If you just take a look at this little image that's here, what would be abiotic factors here? Mean that they're non-living, but they might contribute to our survival in some capacity. Just looking at this picture right here.
I guess like the dirt and stuff like that.
What is it?
Like the dirt and stuff like that.
Yeah, soil, dirt, water, sunlight. These are all non-living factors, right? So those are examples of abiotic factors, non-living, okay? Make sure you have, I'm getting the feeling that you guys didn't read and do that annotation guide as I had asked you to do. So I'm gonna have to switch gears with you all a little bit and have some more homework and quizzes. Okay.
But I don't remember some of these terms. I don't remember that.
Okay. All right, and so then the last or highest level of organization would be the biosphere, and that's everything within the Earth's surface. All right, so we have our biological levels of organization where we have cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and the entire organism. And then we have ecological levels of organization where we have the individual, a population, a community, an ecosystem, and then the biosphere. All right. This is just another schematic. Again, for those of us that are visual can see this a little bit differently. And we'll start here at the cell, right? We know that all living things are made up of cells. So we're looking at a human here. Human cells form tissue, right? These tissues form organs. Organs function together as an organ system. And then we have the entire organism. In later chapters, we'll go back and kind of go subcellular and go a little bit backwards, and we'll see what's actually inside the cell. We'll look at these organelles and their various functions, right? And we'll look at the macromolecules that are also fueling our cells to be able to carry out the jobs that they have every day, right? And then this is just another visual for our ecological levels of organization. Make sure you have these both in your notes so that you can list and identify the levels of organization for a human, for a human, and for from an ecological standpoint, right? The individual, population, community, ecosystem, making sure that you understand that the ecosystem is the first level of organization where we take into account non-living factors, right? Up until this point, ecologists are studying all living factors, individuals, populations, communities. These are all still composed of living organisms. Right? This plant, these frogs, this worm, they're all living factors, okay? Ecosystem, now we're concerned with the roles of abiotic factors in sustaining life, okay? And then we have the biosphere. All right, let's stop right here for today. I don't want to overkill. This is a lot of information. I'm gonna stop